no secret. It's plain to see. I love you, and you love me. It's no secret. You know it's true. You love me. I love you. The only time we seem to meet is in the middle of the night. Only then can I feel your heartbeat, 'cause something's not right. Together I see you and me, always and all time. But not everyone would agree. To them it's a crime, it's no secret. It's plain to see. Yes, I love you, and you love me. And it's no secret. You know it's true. You love me. Yes, I love you.
Hello, 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 beautiful people, and welcome to episode 27 of Survivor Strong, the podcast for survivors of childhood trauma. I'm so excited because today we have Julie Bonn Blank back with us. Yay! Welcome back, Julie. And Julie's here to continue our discussion. And as a reminder, Julie is a survivor of child sexual abuse, multiple abusive relationships, and has since become a certified domestic abuse advocate, abuse recovery trainer, abuse healing coach, and facilitator of the Survivor Voices Committee for the Family Justice Center of Washington County, Oregon. Welcome back, Julie. So happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for putting up with my schedule and having part two a few weeks later instead of the next week.
Well, I'm just glad that we were able to work it out. So it all works out. So when I had you on here last time, we fully intended to talk about the 8 types of abuse. And because we were talking about all sorts of other things, we didn't get to that. So I wanted to start today by talking about that, the 8 types of abuse. What are they?
I think that's a great idea to follow up on because the majority of the world will actually teach that there are 3 types, and they will teach physical and sexual and emotional abuse. And at ARMS, the organization that I work for, we actually teach 8. We've gone more into the psychological and more into the back end of people's brains and what happens there. And so the 8 types that we teach are psychological, physical, sexual, property, animal, spiritual, financial, and verbal abuse are the 8 types that we teach. And there's all kinds of things in those categories, of course. There's things you would expect. There's things you would not expect. For instance, under verbal abuse, we have listed the silent treatment. And people wonder about that because you're not using your words, but that is the idea. You're not using your words, so that is considered verbal abuse to give somebody the silent treatment. Another thing that is uncommon and not actually on the list, but I bring it up anyway because I want to bring it up, and that is pornography. Pornography, if not desired by both partners, is a form of sexual abuse and should be in that sexual abuse category. And all abuse is psychological. So no matter what category you're putting it into, as the main category, there is an element of psychological abuse, as well as abuse that is just psychological, like the mind games and the gaslighting and those kinds of things that we talk about. So those are the 8 types. So when you sit there and you say, well, my relationship isn't really healthy, but I've decided it's not abusive, it's just toxic. That's a warning red flag to me that you probably have some abuse going on in that relationship. And just because that person hasn't thrown you down the stairs or threatened you with a gun or raped you or whatever does not mean that there is not abuse going on in that relationship. And that's why I like people to be aware of all those categories.
Right. And I want to break it down a little bit more because you did go over them quickly. So the 8 types of abuse, let's discuss them one by one if we can, just to make sure everybody understands exactly what each of them are. So what's the number one form of abuse, do you think?
The number one form is definitely psychological abuse because it's included in every single category. It's the most common. It is also one of the most difficult ones to heal from. And we need to change our education, our thinking on that, because the world thinks that, if you're beat up and tortured or whatever, that, that's the worst to heal from. But we have found in our work with survivors that really it's the psychological abuse that occurs along with that. That is the toughest and the hardest to deal from. So, psychological can be anything from coercion to mind games to gaslighting, like we mentioned. It can be things like making you feel like you're nuts. Again, an example I give is a couple that was living with the lady's mother, and they got in this big fight, and her husband was gone later. And so she was talking to her mom about it and saying, man, he threatened this and I don't know what to do. And I was really scared. Were some key words that she used. And the husband walked back in the middle of that and was like, Mary, what are you talking about? We did not have that huge argument. You are exaggerating. You are saying things that aren't there. In the first time or 2 or 3 or 4 that happens, we want to say, no, I know it happened. I know it did. I know it happened like I thought it happened. And we want to defend that. But after you have years of that and it's been going on and on and on, you really do start to doubt yourself. And you start to think maybe the fight wasn't that bad after all. So I had a gal on a call a couple of weeks ago that said, I am so confused because my boyfriend wants to go out to dinner tonight. And I said, what's going on? And she said, he broke up with me last week. He dumped me out on the side of the road. And he said, I never want to see you again. And he roared off. She goes, would that not indicate to you that he was breaking up with me? And I said, absolutely, that would indicate that to me. Well, now he's contacting her going, so what's up, babe? Where are we going out tonight and what are we doing? And she goes, I'm so confused. Those are mind games. And that's a psychological abuse is an example of things, depriving people of things, treating your partner like a servant or like somebody who's supposed to serve you or always have dinner on the table or whatever that might be. And then the physical, and that's more obvious. We call it the sanity abuse for a reason because we often see effects of that. If you see somebody in the store with a black eye, you might feel inclined enough to say, hey, are you okay? And these days, a lot of people don't say that, of course, but that's more indicative of physical abuse. But then again, you can have physical abuse that you don't see signs of. And I will give strangulation as an example. And the correct term is strangulation, not choking. Choking is when you choke on an object. Strangulation is when somebody has impeded your airway, whether it's with their full hands around your neck or whether it's just like this for even 3 to 5 seconds can do brain damage. And we have found more and more often now that strangulation does not necessarily leave a physical bruise or a sign. So in the old days, they would be like, was she strangulated? Look for bruises, but that's not necessarily the case. So all the categories are physical that include any kind of use of the body, whether it's that person's or the other person's. And then sexual abuse, I mentioned pornography, but there's also rape, of course, in that. There's unwanted touch. There can be things like making somebody dress sexy when they don't want to dress sexy or insisting that they wear, certain things. It is coercion and manipulation for sex. If you don't do this, I'm going to go somewhere else, or you're my partner, and then that's part of what we talked about is that I require this 3 times a week, whether you are really up to it or not, that is all sexual abuse. Pouting for
Right.
sex. And we also find that part of sexual abuse, that there's a component of extreme jealousy usually involved with that sexual abuse. So we have that in that category. Property. Go ahead.
I just wanted to interject that I'm really glad that we're talking about this today, because there are a lot of women who, and men too, who are probably in relationships with women who force them to have sex when they don't want to. But it's so important that they realize that that is sexual abuse. It's not normal
Right.
for a partner to do those things or request those things. Anything that is outside of what you want to do, outside of your comfort zone,
Mhm.
that's sexual abuse. And I think a lot of people minimize that. So I'm so glad that we're talking about that, because
Mhm.
I've heard people say, well, but he was my husband. Well, that doesn't matter.
Right.
Your husband doesn't have the right to do that to you either. So
Right.
so I'm sorry for cutting you off. I just wanted to interject that.
No, it's good. It's important. And again, I could talk forever. So if you don't interrupt me,
Yeah,
we
I
might
know.
all be in trouble. But yeah, let me reiterate that too, that, sexual abuse is also making you do anything you're uncomfortable with. So if he wants a certain type of sex and you're like, man, I kind of grew up thinking that was really wrong, or whatever the case might be, and I'm uncomfortable with that, your partner that honors and respects and loves you is going to say, okay, it's not a problem, versus a partner that insists, on those types of things. Same
Like,
thing
oh,
with
you're
toys.
doing it. Oh, like you're doing it for me,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we tend to think that as partners, well, I'm supposed to give, I'm supposed to satisfy this other person, and they satisfy me, and that's how it works. And, be very cautious there. That's a huge red flag if they're insisting on, even gently insisting and being persistent,
Mhm.
about certain types of
And
that.
you mentioned toys. That goes with toys as
Yep,
well.
toys fall into that category. Some
Yeah,
people want to try them. Some people are really uncomfortable with them. But again, somebody who honors and respects you is going to respect what you want in the bedroom and honor that, as well as everywhere else in your life. So things
absolutely.
to keep in mind. Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah. So then there's property abuse, and that's any damage to any property. So that could be a cell phone. That could be grabbing it from you when you're trying to call 911 or trying to call your mother. It could be punching walls, slamming doors, breaking things, use of weapons, things like that. So anything that includes property. So as I go over all these, you can kind of probably start to pick up that when you think about an abusive incident in your life, whether it was you on the giving end or you on the receiving end, that it had multiple of these types of abuse within that scenario. And so as part of our processing, when we work in intervention groups, at ARMS, is they relate their stories when they were abusive, and then they're required to list out every type of these 8 types of abuse that they used in that scenario. And then, of course, we go on to talk about how it could have been, done better and what they would do differently next time. But there is a wide variety. So anytime there's an animal present, we would consider it animal abuse. Why? Because an animal shows fear. A dog will cower, a cat will run when there's abuse in the home, and they
So
know
you're
it's
saying,
coming.
if there are animals present in the home, that's
Mhm.
also abuse towards the animals as
We
well.
would consider that as well, because you're instilling fear in,
Right.
psychological, into that animal. But of course, it can also be much more obvious, like kicking the dog, or
Yes.
here's
Right.
one, yeah, or here's one we hear. So somebody brings home a pet that you're afraid of, a
Mm.
snake, and they knew you were afraid of it, and they brought it home anyway. That's not just
Uh,
abuse to you. That's abuse to, the animal, or something that you're allergic to. It's an outright disregard for, what your feelings are. And so we would categorize that as well. And it could be neglect of a pet. It could also be paying more attention to the pet than you. So your
oh,
partner gets a puppy, and
yes.
it's like, obviously it becomes really obvious that the puppy's taken more time than you, and that person's using that puppy as an excuse,
Hmm.
to not sit on the couch with you and watch TV at night, but to, whatever. That can also be animal abuse as well. So, and then when you look at spiritual abuse, I think is not highlighted enough these days, but it's incredibly important because not only is it like misusing concepts and verses that God didn't intend them to be used for, but it's also things like, your spiritual, your religious life, whatever it is that you believe, it's not letting you live that life. It's making you change to a church that you didn't know about. I had a friend a couple months ago that her husband went. They were going to a church with her family, and he went church shopping without her. And then he came home and said, guess what? We're moving churches, and this is where we're going. And in doing so, he isolated her from her family and friends that attend that congregation. And she was trying to be the good wife, right? This is what my husband said. We're going to church, so here we go. So that can also be spiritual abuse. When you demand submission, or obedience, that is spiritual abuse. We also consider it spiritual abuse when there's children present. And I'll explain that a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, because, God is seen, whether you're, whatever your God is seen as your spiritual father. Pretty much, right? And we already have history and case studies that show us that those of us who grew up in abuse, especially with a father figure, have a very hard time believing that there's a loving and kind God, up there somewhere. So anytime that a child is present, we also consider it spiritual abuse because they are looking up to that, father figure as a reflection of God, in their life someday. So we put that in that category. And then there's verbal, which is also pretty obvious, except for the silent treatment, which I mentioned, but it could be put downs, swearing at people, abusive jokes. If you're going to, gatherings and you're always the brunt of your partner's jokes, that is not funny. Or his sarcasm, right? That's not funny. If it makes you feel this high and you're like, I don't even want to go to this gathering because I know he's going to get drunk and start saying this stuff about me, then that's a big red flag. Your partner who honors you is not going to be putting you down in front of other people and doing those things. And even in the name of sarcasm, know that sarcasm can be funny. And I even find myself being sarcastic in my life at times. But there's always something underneath sarcasm. So there's always some bit of truth for starters, right? And it can be very demeaning to other people. So be sarcastic if you want. I am. I go to gatherings, I'm sarcastic, but I'm not sarcastic about other people. It's more about circumstances. I don't put other people down in that regard because it can become a cover for that. So if your partner is always being sarcastic and it's about you, then that's something to look at, that would be in that verbal abuse category. So, and note that at the center of all these behaviors is power and control. That's what it comes down to with the 8 types of abuse. So I hope that you all will consider those other types that are not so seen, that are unseen. And those of you who are wondering, am I in abuse? He just screams at me every weekend. Does that mean he's abusive? That might help you determine some of that is a type of abuse, and that can be very damaging.
And I want to give anybody who's here an opportunity. Do you want to ask a question? Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask regarding your own situation? If you'd like to, that you can request to join. And then I'll see your request and I'll let you on. But anytime throughout, if you have any questions, you can type it out in the Q&A section, and we'll be sure to check that throughout and answer any questions that you have. So I don't see any requests just yet, so we can go ahead and move on.
All right. So those were the 8 types of abuse, just so that everybody is aware. And I would much rather that became the norm than the 3 types that are out there, because there's so much more than physical and sexual and emotional abuse that occurs. And I really believe it can help with our healing to actually hone into it, and to understand the damage that these things do cause. So
I totally agree with you. And like you said, earlier on we talked about, is there one abuse that's quote unquote worse than the other? And going back to the psychological abuse, I can say that in my own personal situations, that's the stuff that stuck with me the longest. What people said to me because after a while I started to believe it. And that's what happens is they start to put you down. You start to believe what they're saying, which affects your self-esteem, which is one way that these abusers gain power and control over you
Mhm.
is by having you question your own self-confidence and who you are. Um, and, another question that a lot of people might have is do abusers show potential warning signs before they abuse you? I mean, someone could be in a new, excuse me, a new relationship and, excuse me, and, their partner hasn't necessarily abused them, but they may have noticed, quick tempers. Is there any
Mhm.
warning signs that people can look out for?
Yeah, I would have to say yes and no on that. We do have on the ARMS website, which is just abuserecovery.org, under resources, there is an article about 15 signs of abusive behaviors, of potential abusive behaviors. And there's a lot of them listed. However, having that said, I have also met, survivors that there is no warning sign at all, or they didn't see them and it was a very quick thing. Usually there's warning signs and we're not seeing them. I call them red flags, and we don't pay attention to them because we love this person, right? Or we have great hopes for this relationship,
Right. Yeah.
and or maybe it was just us. Maybe we're, exaggerating things a little bit, like we just talked about. But yeah, some warning signs can be like extreme jealousy. Um, for instance, where are you going Friday night? Oh, I want to go out with my friends. No, no, Friday nights belong to me. Well, okay, I'll let you go Friday night, but you've got to tell me where you're at. And he texts you the whole time, right? Where you at? What are you doing? Who are you with? Um, Things like, why are you home late from work? Oh, sorry, we had a meeting and it went overtime and I couldn't even, grab the phone to text you because, I was in a meeting and we're not supposed to take our phones, into meetings. And he's like, I don't believe you. You were out with some guy, weren't you? You left, you left work early and you were out with somebody. Who were you out with? Tell me right now who you were out with. Extreme jealousy. The right partner, the partner who respects you and honors you and loves you, is going to welcome the idea that you have other people in your life and that's okay. And they're going to trust you and they're going to want you to fulfill yourself in that way by spending time with other people who are good people. And they're going to come home. You're going to come home from your event or whatever you were at or being late, and they're going to welcome you with dinner, or they're going to, welcome you with a glass of wine or whatever, instead of saying, where were you? You were supposed to be home, 2 hours ago, and you're not answering your phone. So extreme jealousy is definitely something to be very wary of. Like you mentioned, anger, a very quick rise to anger. We used to say, people, that's really bad now, but they used to say, people with red hair, right? They get mad really quick.
Oh,
And of course, that's not true.
right,
People with
right,
red hair do not necessarily get mad really quick.
right,
It may indicate their heritage, but, not
right,
much,
right.
not much else. But if your partner has a quick escalation to making mountains out of molehills, let's put it that way. Something that should have been this big, and they blow it out completely out of proportion and pretty quickly. That is a warning sign. Any anger or jealousy is, a warning sign of things that could come. Any isolation. So here's what I heard early in my marriage: we probably shouldn't see your parents so much because every time we do, we end up fighting afterwards. And I was like, oh yeah, he's right. We do. Well, that's because my parents were bringing up concerns, that they saw, and I would go home and try to address that with him. But it was a way of isolating me and trying to get me to be not so attached, even though I was in my young 20s, to my folks, and to not talk to them so much, and especially not to tell them everything that was going on, and to put
Yeah.
them in a bad light. So yeah, those are warning signs you should watch out for. And again, that article has 15 of them, and it's actually a really
Sure.
good article. So I would
Well, thank you
pursue that.
for sharing that website with us.
Sure.
That's really helpful. And as you just mentioned, you've had your own relationships, abusive relationships, and we had just started to get into your 17-year marriage that you said is the most impactful abusive relationship that you've ever had. So I think now's a good opportunity to get into that. You just mentioned some of the warning signs that you had. So tell us more about this experience. Was it Physical, mental, emotional, all of the above. Tell us more.
So my story is also includes substance abuse and drug addiction. And I want to say that up front. And I want to say it for two reasons. For number one, I want you to understand that. But number two, I want you to understand that substance abuse and domestic abuse are two different things.
Yes.
And how often do I hear on the phone when I'm talking to, a survivor who says, well, if he hadn't been drunk and or, if she hadn't been smoking weed, this never would have happened. And or if he wasn't depressed, or he would just get help for his depression and go to counseling and get on meds. I know that's what he needs. If he had done this abusive incident would not have happened. And I want to emphasize that because if not the case, some of these things will trigger abuse. But in order to be abusive, there's a belief system there that's buried underneath in all of us, and it's in our survivor mode as well. And the way we react, the way we stick around, the way we return to abuse sometimes, time after time, it's all in that belief system underneath. That's kind of the foundation of our house. And so that's what we have to address in order to get better. And it's the same with, an abuser. So here's an example. We see people all the time that get drunk, in the evening or whatever and aren't abusive, right? Mm-hmm. We know friends probably who smoke weed or whatever and still choose to not be abusive. So there's some type of belief going on in the foundation of that person's house, their inner house, that is okay to behave like this. So I want to emphasize in my story that the substance abuse was completely different than the domestic abuse, and it was definitely a problem and caused us great grief. But somebody could have chosen to not be abusive even though they were addicted. So.
Right. So in other words, addiction is never an excuse for domestic violence.
Correct. Yes. Or mental illness.
Right.
We get a lot of that, as well. And or ADHD and or,
let the list go on and
whatever
on.
you want to go for. Yeah. He's got ADHD. He just can't control himself. And that's not the case. The case is there's people living vibrantly every day with those, particular issues and choose to be non-abusive. So
yes,
keep that in mind. So I just had a feeling I should say that. I think there's somebody out there that needed to hear that. So
yes, indeed.
Given that, my story, I did not get a lot of warning signs before we got married. And I think if I had, I probably would have ignored them. I did, however, get two parents who really did not want me to marry this person. And of course, I'm looking back years later. Hindsight's 2020. And eventually they gave in, of course, and things seemed fine. But his control of our relationship started right after our honeymoon. When we came home early from our honeymoon, my girlfriends from the wedding were still in town and they wanted to get together. And they said, let's do lunch and go to the mall. They wanted to hear all about the honeymoon and all of those fun things. And, I was like, oh, that's so cool. And I hung up the phone. And I went to him and I told him, that, we want to get together and go to lunch, go to the mall. And he was like, absolutely not. And I'm like, okay. I was confusion is your very first sign. Confusion. I was so confused. I was like, what? And then he was like, by doing this, you're choosing them over me, and technically this is still our honeymoon, so what do you think you're doing going off with your friends? And that would be wrong. And at the time I reacted like most of us react. I was irritated, but this was a new marriage and I loved him. And I had also been raised with, you make it work. And he's kind of the head of the household and all those kinds of things. And so I said, okay. And I didn't go, but it didn't settle well, in my gut. I was kind of like, okay, but that definitely increased over the years. And it got to a point a few years later where we had two young children and I was not allowed to attend my brother's wedding, which was in California. I was in Washington at the time. And to me, that was like not excusable. I was like, this is a family event. This is huge. My brother's getting married probably for the first and only time. And whoever thought he would have got married anyway, but thank goodness he found a lovely lady. So, and I was told, no, we have two young kids and you shouldn't go do this. Again, you're choosing them over me and blah, 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 blah. And all these control things, right? Day after day after day after day.
Yeah.
And so what did I do? I got him help with childcare. And then I went back to him and I said, your mom said she'll come help with the kids and blah, 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 blah. And it was still, no, I don't want you to go. We don't have the money. We don't have the money for you to go. There's always a reason, right?
Right.
And you'll be gone too long. And I got stubborn at that point. And of course, other incidents that had happened in between. So throughout the few years, there'd been quite a few like instances of verbal abuse, as well as psychological abuse and some physical as well that I now see, right? I didn't see it so clearly then. And I went to the wedding anyway, and I took literally, I flew in, I went to the wedding, I went to 1 hour of the reception, I went back to the airport to go home so that I was only gone one day, so that the impact on him would be as least as possible, so that the consequences on me would be as least as possible. And there were still days and days of consequences when I got home. And I look back at that now and I think, wow, Julie, I was in survivor mode, right? I was doing whatever it took so that we weren't consequences at home, and especially so the kids didn't suffer any consequences. If there were any, they needed to be on me, right? Not on them. That I actually went to my brother's wedding and stayed 3 hours and left. And I just look at that now. I don't laugh at it. I look at it now and it just makes me sad that I was that extreme in controlling my actions in my life to do that. But that was the name of the game for 17 years. And at the time, I thought that I was being submissive and letting him be the lead. And it's funny now because I'm pretty stubborn, and my husband now, my second husband, is like, I can't imagine you ever putting up with that. But it's true. But it wears us down. It really does, wear us down. And so, his addiction got worse as well. He was addicted to opiates, and he was an early patient of the pain clinics when they opened, and he was on morphine, and he refused to give it up. Even some doctors throughout the years, and even nurses, would say, hey, maybe it's time to look at some other pain killing, opportunities. And he'd say no. And literally he got kicked out of like 4 clinics because he would overuse every month and go through withdrawal. And there'd be 3 or 4 days where he was in bed, hardly breathing. And I was terrified, taking care of the kids.
And so wouldn't that be another form of abuse too, though, if you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The fact that somebody is misusing, the very definition of abuse is the misuse of, right?
Yeah.
So not only was he misusing his medication, but he was misusing me,
right.
And being abusive of me in that process. So, and some would say the very definition of addiction is that you can't control it. And I would say, there's always a choice. He could have absolutely said, gee, my family is a higher priority than this, and I think I probably need to go to rehab and try to work on some other pain, ways to control my pain. But the mode was, no, I'm never giving up my pills. I'm never giving up my pills, and, be damned whoever suffers, it doesn't matter. And so, yes, that is also a form of abuse that we would consider, mostly psychological, but at times it did get physical, it did get sexual. And it was a long 17 years. And yet I still loved him like most survivors do. We don't leave and flee because we don't love them anymore. We leave and flee because we can't do it anymore, and we can't change them. We can only change ourselves. And ours really accumulated into and it wasn't the accumulation, it wasn't the end, but what finally brought it all to a head where, enough was enough and paperwork got filed was 5 days of hell is what I call it. He had overdosed on his steroids that he was using, and he had steroids along with opiates, and I had tried to control his doses. They were injectables, so I had to give them to him. He was only supposed to have them during certain times. And when I finally refused to stop giving them off schedule, I walked in the bedroom and he had our kids giving them to him in his injection.
How old were the kids at the time?
His hips. So they were 8 and 7 and 3.
Oh my God. So these are babes.
They were, and my daughter still feels to this day she did a lot of caregiving for her dad, and she did.
I'm
but
sure. Yeah.
And so then it was back to either I do this or he's going to make them do that. And we didn't know that's what happened at the time. We just know it was 5 days of hell where he was in a psychosis. He was packing his gun around the house. At one time, I was sleeping on the couch, and at one time I got the gun. I ran in and got it when he finally went to the bathroom because he wasn't sleeping at all. So I couldn't get it. And I'm like, now what do I do with it, right? And I'm like, well, if I leave with it, it leaves the kids in the house with him, and that's really dangerous right now. So I'm not going to do that. And so literally, I put it under the couch cushion, the gun, and I sat on the cushion. And I knew he was going to discover it was gone and come out, and absolutely he did, and was hugely angry and verbally, abusive. During this 5 days, I called the cops and I called 911 4 different times. And this was a very small coastal town that we lived in. And my partner, my husband, was a former police officer. And what I heard when they got there, not only were him spouting absolute lies about me and just crazy things, but basically they would pat him on the shoulder and say, sorry, you're having a bad day, brother. And they would help with whatever. And I would ask them to transport him because something was wrong, something was going on, and they wouldn't. Because he said no, because he knew his name and he knew his zip code. They did take the gun that the first time, thank God. But they left the kids and I in the house with him. Just the total wrong move. And I hope that we know better these days.
I hope so too.
Take the wife and kids to a safer place. But that didn't happen. And it was 5 days of no sleeping, and of his ranting and raving and pacing and, gunning and knocking things over. I hit my daughter in her head with a lamp, flooded the bathroom completely. It was just hellish. It was horrible. Wow. And I finally contacted his caseworker. My parents were in Arizona at the time, and I was texting them throughout, but trying to keep the house really quiet because that just stirred him up, made him become more abusive. And finally called his caseworker at the Medicare office, and they said, you need to file temporary guardianship. And I didn't have the money. My folks paid for it. Somehow I got out of the house that day to meet with an attorney who went before the judge for me. And they declared him incompetent, basically temporarily based on his actions. And so the next time I called 911, I had paperwork, and they came and they said, do you want to go to the hospital? And he said, no. And they're like, what's your name? What's your zip code? And he said all that, super intelligent. He passed 3 psychological examinations in our 17 years of marriage. Wow. And they are very intelligent. And so I handed them the paperwork and I said, I'm his guardian and you are taking him. And they finally did. They loaded him up. At the hospital, he did get combative, and so they had to restrain him, and then he stopped breathing. So the doctor came to me and said, do we have permission to tube him? And, at that point, we had kind of decided, in our marriage, if there was any chance of life, that we would do so. And so I said, yes, go ahead and put him on the respirator and hopefully save his life. And the doctor turned and looked at me and said, well, I think it's probably too late for that, but we'll give it a try. So they tubed him. They transferred him to a big city hospital, put him in a medical-induced coma for 2 weeks. Served him with the guardianship papers upon his awakening, which, gave fuel to the fire. And it went downhill. It went downhill from there. So we, at one time, he was doing pretty good in the hospital because he's finally off all his meds. And at one time, my dad met with him and said, we'd like you to go into some kind of care home for a while. If you don't, we set a boundary. We said, if you don't, Julie and the kids are not going to be there when you get back. And he, again, chose to go home and chose his medications and on all those things over us. This happened multiple times, which is abusive, just like you said. Mm-hmm. So he came home to my dad sitting in there being in the house, being his caregiver, and they moved us out into we basically switched houses for a while. But the abuse continued because I was trying to get the kids to see him, like on the weekends and things. And I couldn't go by myself. I had to bring my dad. I had to bring a friend because he would just light into me and scream at me and say these awful things to me because he was so very, very angry and he was being abusive. And somebody said a key phrase to me one time. And now I tell my gals about it all the time because I feel like he would always amp me up, right? Get me to a point where, we're like fighting, and I heard the phrase in my head and I would tell other people when they said, what's going on? This is kind of what's going on in this relationship? My brother at one point even said, is this what my wife and I should expect? And 7 years we'd been married 7 years at the time. And I would say things like, yeah, he knows how to push my buttons.
Mm.
And now that I know the cycle of abuse, and that there's a setup for the abuse before an abuse, no matter what it is, even if it's just psychological or verbal or whatever, there is a setup. And that was the setup in our marriage, is that he would know how to push my buttons to get us to the point, where he had permission in himself to be abusive, which never gives you permission. So, we went on to years of manipulation, years of me being determined to not speak badly about him, but him not believing the same thing, and convincing the kids absolutely when he had them that I was the worst mother ever, and that I had done so many bad things and took all his money and, all these things. And they would actually literally come home from their visits and be sad for 3 days and say, Mom, why did you do this? And why did you leave Dad? Psychological abuse at its worst. We see a lot of that post-separation, as they lose control over you, they try to control more of what you have in common. So in our case, that was children.
Yeah.
And I see that in cases I work, today as well. And it was a tough time to get your character assassinated when you weren't really that type of person. And not only that, but you'd made a commitment to not speak badly of him and felt like that was the right thing to do. So it would literally take me 2 or 3 days to get the kids back to normal, and back to normal schedules and feeling okay about things. And then I'd have to send them off to their dads again. At one time we moved back in together. Now I look back and I think, wow, that's a crazy move. But at the time, he was going to lose his health insurance and benefits if he didn't increase his household size. And I felt responsible for that because I was the working one in the family and he was on disability. I would do it differently now. I would say, you better get some roommates or something of the nature, because we moved back in together. Again, things got abusive. We were separated. I mean, we had separate bedrooms and we were not in a relationship. And there was one instance of sexual assault. There was an instance of physical abuse where he backed me up into the kitchen pantry. There were those really sharp, prongy, pokey, shelves, the white ones that have all that. Yeah. And, that got bad. And then finally, we'd had enough. He moved out at that point. And then some really bad things happened after that point as well. So the kids continued to visit with him. My son eventually moved in to kind of become his caregiver. He started doing meth, and it was really horrible. The texts that we were getting and the paranoia, and the psych ward called me. They got him once shining his flashlight into people's windows and saying he was the police. And they told me, they said, in his condition, if he's doing meth, he's not going to last very long. And I was like, oh my gosh. But I was no longer his next representative. Our daughter was, because we're divorced at this point. And so she went in and tried to talk him into going to rehab. And it was no. I called his sisters and I said, this is what your brother is doing. I need help. They came and tried to talk to them. And he's like, I'm not moving back with you guys because I'm not giving up my pills. And so he did pass away due to his decisions and his paranoia. And it was really hard. And, I still loved him at that point. And it was grief on top of the grieving the 17 years of abusive behavior, and of things that should never, ever have even happened in the first place. And so, enough shoulda, coulda, woulda. Look at me. I'm like, okay, it's time to make a difference. And so I really settled in. Along with the grief, I settled into, I'm going to heal. I'm not only going to heal, but I'm going to make an impact. And I'm going to make a change. And so that's my determination and stubbornness, coming
good
through
for you
once again. And was rewarded with reconnecting with my my second husband. So we knew each other in college, but we both went off our separate ways and married. And his wife was killed in an accident. And I walked alongside their family during that time. And then my ex died, and we kind of looked at each other and went, there's something more here than meets the eye. And So I have been very happily married in a second marriage, but I think that was my reward. So I do talk to gals all the time that are so afraid of being alone, and that's one of our fears of leaving abuse is the loneliness and
Yeah.
being without a partner. But I really believe that if you work on your healing and you work hard on it, that there is better out there, and you're certainly worthy and deserving of better out there. And so when I met my husband, when I reconnected with him a second time, I said, I don't understand why you're drawn to me. I said, I've had so much abuse, which we talked about in our last episode, and my huge timeline of all this. I said, why are you drawn to me? And he told me, he said, because abuse is part of your story, he said, but it's not your identity.
Right.
And that really struck me. And I tell my gals that, abuse is part of your story. It always will be, but it does not have to become your identity. Your identity is who you are, what you're working toward, how God sees you. It's about your future. It's not about your past. And so it is possible to plow through, and to heal and to have those rewards from healing.
Absolutely.
Your beautiful life. Yeah.
Absolutely. And how long was it after the incident where he would, you were talking to the sisters? How long after that did he pass?
Oh boy, 3 years.
3 years. So it was 3 years. So basically 3 years of back and forth of you dealing, and you were still taking care of him when he passed away.
To a certain extent, we were living in separate houses, and I wasn't really at that point. I was sending extra groceries with the kids because I knew that there wasn't much in the house.
But you were still very much present in his life and doing things. And
I would, in fact, one of the hard things about that time was that part of the psychological abuse is they turn, they have a camp and you have a camp. I explained to my gals, and it's important that everybody has their camp, and so. But he turned his family against me, and it was so hard because they had been my family too for 17 years. But that was healed later on because when he was going through all the meth and stuff, and I was calling him and I was saying help and all this, they said, we're sorry. They said this whole time he has presented you as, a total witch, and we thought you did not have his best interests at heart, but now we see that you did. And so that is a hard part that a lot of people go through, not just me. I talk to gals all the time. And so I tried to focus on my camp, my supporters, my camp, and realize that he had his camp, and that's how I got through it. But even that can be, healed in later years. And in this case, it was when he was, almost gone from us. But, thank goodness that happened because that brought a little bit of healing to my heart. I will never get an I'm sorry or an acknowledgement from him. He's gone now. That won't happen. But I did realize that's not necessary for my healing. But reconnecting with family was a good thing and was helpful in that.
Right. And how did you cope with life after he passed, after all of this ended? How did you cope? I mean, how did you heal? What tactics did you use?
Well, I would have to say that the Her Journey program at ARMS was really the main thing for me for healing. I had heard about the program through my church, and I, being a type A, marched into group thinking I'm going to lead these groups and I'm going to tell these women, they don't have to put up with this stuff. And as I would leave each lesson with tears rolling down my face, I realized, I wasn't ready. And my leader knew that too, but I had a very kind and understanding leader who I think saw that potential, in me, and certainly that desire that I was feeling called to do something more, with my healing. And so that program was the most healing for me. Now things are ongoing, and obviously I moved forward with them. I did become a leader eventually, and now I've been on staff for 4 years. So that's another one of my rewards for healing, is that I get to work, with all these ladies. Recently I started even coaching, domestic violence coaching, on the weekends and on the side. And there is nothing better than walking through. I'm so sorry this stuff has to happen, and it happened to me too, and it shouldn't have to happen, and you're worthy of so much more, and it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility and my responsibility to choose to move forward, right, and to heal.
Absolutely.
It's huge. So the Her Journey program was most helpful for me. I have since done many things, a lot of reading I do. My spiritual walk was important to me, getting back to God as my first love, and realizing that he's the one I need to please and nobody else. Being able to set my boundaries. I still continue to learn about boundaries because I still see myself struggle a little bit with them in certain areas, maybe with a grown child or maybe with a friend. And I know where that got me before. And so I am really watchful of that now. And as hard as it is, I really work hard in my life to set those boundaries and to keep those boundaries. That could be a whole nother talk on just
Oh, yeah, boundaries. Oh my God, absolutely. I agree.
sure.
I agree.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then there's other programs out there too. We have a tab on the ARM site, the abuserecovery.org, that has other healing programs. I did attend a short time of Flying Free Now, Natalie Hoffman's program. That was helpful to me. I was kind of vetting it out to see if I would recommend it for other people, but in the process, it helped me as well. And I did do some therapy with a person at our church at the time, and that was not long term. That was more to get through the crisis portion of everything. I did do that as well. And then I found healing in my activity. I mean, when we leave abuse, we find ourselves again, finally, right? And I remembered, I like to write, and I like the color blue, and all these things that had been put on the back shelf. And so I was called back to writing, because I had been writing almost my whole life, but I was not able to in that traumatic period of my life. And the writing of these things became part of my healing as well as my speaking. So every time I think I'm healed, there's one more little step, and maybe it will be a lifetime thing. But I can tell you I'm a heck of a lot healthier now, obviously than I was. And I hope to continue to get healthier.
absolutely. I'm so proud of you for all that you've done. I know it wasn't easy. So what about the kids? How do kids recover from witnessing domestic violence? Because we know this is such, it impacts them. It's a trauma for them to witness this. How do they heal? And how do we talk about domestic violence? What is just enough information to give them about domestic violence, and what's too much, for people who want to talk to their kids about it?
Yeah, I could write a book on that one too, boy. Because boy, did I learn. A lot of it depends on the age of your kids, of course.
Yes.
First of all, realize that even if the abuse was not directed toward your children, that they have been affected by abuse in the home. In fact, the recent studies show that they are affected just as much as if they had been the target of the abuse. Please keep that in mind. I want you to keep that in mind. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that I have seen women sadly lose their children, not because they're being abusive, but because they didn't leave the abuser and their kids were not protected. And they then have to work a program, and they come to our program as a part of that and do all these things. And it's so much grief to lose your kids into the foster system because you didn't keep them safe. So know that the effects on them, no matter their age, are the same as if they're being abused.
Yeah.
And that you need to keep them as a priority, no matter how buried you are and how you can't think straight. Love your kids, at least love your kids enough to say, no more in your own life to abuse. Now, through that, you may not realize it, and they are particularly will not realize it. But as you heal, your kids heal.
Sure.
We pass on these nuggets that we learn. We start living a healthy life. We have healthy relationships and partners and friendships, and they see these things modeled for them. And there is some healing that comes from that. Now, they may get to a point where they need some of their own healing measures. They may need specific therapy for kiddos, who have had trauma. Right. They may show these things. I did write an article once on our blog, I think, of things that they show when there's problems. And those are things you would see when there's other problems too. But if you see a drop in grades, if you see they're having nightmares, if their behavior changes, if they're becoming abusive, because that's pretty frequent when they grow up in abuse and they see it. If they start treating you abusively, because that's how your partner treated you, and they think it's okay to do that, there's many signs that you can watch for, then more additional help, is needed. And then you have, that's when they're younger. When you get teenagers and above, and now I have adult children. Let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to how much should you say? Because when your kids are smaller, that's a harder thing, right? How much should you say?
Yes.
And that was hard. I found really quick that I was not believed by the kids per se when I said things. And again, I went through that period where I'm not going to talk bad about him, right? So this was mostly after he was gone. that this and this happened and some things, and they were like, eh. And it's not like they would give off that vibe of, oh, I don't believe you, Mom. But my youngest really put into perspective for me one day, because I was really upset. I was under the mode right at that time to feel that I needed my kids to validate this in order for me to heal. That ended up not being true, but I was in that mode of believe me, believe me, believe me. Somebody hear me. Somebody listen. Somebody believe me. And the kids have got to understand this happened. And my youngest looked at me and he said, Mom, I don't know who to believe, because if I believe you, that means Dad's a liar.
Right.
And vice versa.
Right.
That put it into perspective for me. And I was like, I was sad, but I was incredibly grateful to realize that beneath, in their hearts and in their hearts, deepest of hearts, they want to believe you. But there's this loyalty issue of, if I believe you, then Dad's a complete liar. And what do I do in my heart about that? When I love Dad, as well. And seeing that, realizing that, hearing that from him really helped me understand the battle that they have, going on in their hearts. So I don't think kids need details. Your kids are not your therapists. You do not need, as I discovered, their validation for you to go forward in your healing. They are going to have to come to their own conclusions, as they grow. And more may come out for them memory-wise, as they grow. And again, the same concept, as I said, with your abuser, is you have your camp of people and he has his. You're going to have to recognize that with your kids as well. You're going to have your camp of people who believe you, who understand you, who support you, and you focus on that. You don't focus on the others that are questioning or not sure. You let them come to their own conclusions, and you've got to let it go and work on your own healing. Nonetheless, as you heal, your kids will heal. And I have found that my kids are closer to adulthood now, but they're still experiencing healing because I'm healing. They just don't know it. Someday when they're 50, they'll probably figure it out, but they have no idea. So know that no matter what step you take in a positive direction, it will affect them in a positive way, as well, for sure.
Absolutely. That's really great advice. Thank you for that. And also, I want you to give the website one more time for anybody who wants any resources, the one that you referred to.
Sure. It's abuserecovery.org.
Abuserecovery.org. And there's a lot of useful information there for you. And I want to, switch gears a little bit, because I was surprised to learn that domestic violence and human trafficking intersect. And that this is something that you talk about because, you don't necessarily think domestic violence and human trafficking are even the same, one and the same, but they do. And, I was so surprised. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I didn't, I write about human trafficking and it's a cause I feel led to, because I was one of those people, one of them, who thought that human trafficking only happened in third world countries. This was several years ago. And boy, was I wrong. And when I realized it happens right here in the United States, in every city, every day, every street, I'm like, this is wrong. We've got to do something about this. And that's why I felt called to do that. And yes, they intersect. So I learned that in my research, because the majority of human trafficking occurs through what we call an intimate partner relationship. And it's not a matter of kidnapping. In my books, there's a kidnapping scene, and it does happen. And I think it happens more than we think, because we can't account for all these children we've never found, right? Right. So I think the stats are off a little bit there. But what the experts say, what we as experts say, is that the majority happen from somebody luring somebody in as an intimate partner. So they become a boyfriend, they become a girlfriend. You discover maybe this person has other partners and other girlfriends, and or there's even a house with these people in it. And it's all charming at first. And there may even be, instances of giving, of paying your way over to the United States, of giving you a job, and gee, you couldn't have got employed without me, and you owe me, by the way, we got rent to pay and groceries, and I'm funding you, and I even let you use my car, you need to pay the car rent for that. And so it becomes very quickly from an intimate partner relationship where somebody feels very charmed and loved to control, as they push them into the trafficking industry, whatever that includes. And sometimes in the United States, that includes strip clubs. I've talked to gals who work in strip clubs that don't want to be there. The majority of them are coerced in some way to be there. And even the ones that say they want to be there and they're earning extra tips for college, there's something that they're placing their value and their worth there for a reason. There's some kind of trauma, in their past that they think they really want to be there and to be looked upon as an object that way. And they really, in their heart of hearts, don't. If you sit down and talk to them, bring them cookies, be their friend, you're going to discover there's, a real person in there that isn't necessarily keen to dancing on stage or whatever. It happens that way. It happens, especially in young people. We've been seeing it where, the gal gets a boyfriend and they're happy and everything seems good. And then all of a sudden he's dropping her off to spend the night with other guys or a couple hours with the other guy. And she realized, well, wait a minute, so I'm supposed to have sex with this person, and then there's some kind of trade, with drugs or cash, and that's, that's trafficking.
And this is a huge red flag, and that people need to be aware of. These young people need to be aware of that this can happen. It starts off with that control, and then before you know it, you're doing things that you don't want to do, and that's why it's so important to get out of those relationships, before you're too invested, or you have, I know you already had your children, but, a lot of times people stay in these relationships and they have kids, and that anchors them even more to the relationship. And it's like, no, try to get out before you have kids. Try to get out way ahead of time. But that's really interesting because I never considered that before, but it's true. And that's a form of sexual abuse as well. If your partner wants you to have sex with other people and you don't want to have sex with other people, that is another form of sexual abuse, another form of abuse in relationships. So I guess it does make sense that it's all connected because, a lot of the, like you said, the power and the control, that's the common denominator here.
Right.
Right. So they have,
and a lot of them have grown up in abuse. So that's another way that it intersects, a lot of even the people, on the streets as an example, the kids on the streets, for example, they've aged out of foster care and, or they were from abusive homes and, or had fostering abuse, and they are pulled into human trafficking because all of a sudden there's somebody who cares about them, and or they desperately need money, and or they responded to an ad for a model or whatever, and it ended up being much more than they thought. And so they do intersect, those types of abuse and cycle of abuse intersects, as well as a relationship, because there's always a higher power there. There's always a pimp. There's always a power over. Not necessarily a pimp, but there's always a power over relationship, whether it's through coercion or whether it's through, physical abuse. So people who grow up in domestic violence are much more likely to wind up in human trafficking.
Right. And that makes sense because they're more prone to think that abuse is normal. That this is what I grew up with. This is what just relationships look like. So that's how witnessing domestic violence as a child, as you grow up as an adult, how it can interfere with your adult relationships and decisions that you make as an adult. So, Julie, I want to thank you so much again for coming back and for round 2 of Survivor Strong with us. I'm probably going to invite you back because we have so many things that we can talk about, boundaries, just the list can go on and on. And so thank you so much. Is there anything that you wanted to say before we close out the show today?
Just take hope. Those of you who are, surviving, maybe still in the midst of it, maybe still co-parenting with an abuser, and how very, very hard that is. That there is hope and there is healing and there is a better life afterwards that will be rewarded when you say no more to abuse. And I just want you to feel encouraged by that today.
I love that. And with that, remember, if you'd like to be a guest on Survivor Strong, you can head over to survivorstrongpodcast.com and fill out the Tell Your Story section. I would love to have you here. We're an inclusive community. We welcome everyone. And we're here to offer encouragement and support to anyone who needs it. So don't be afraid. We're here to hear your story. We want to hear your story because your story deserves to be heard. And so thank you again. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you again for joining me for episode 27 of Survivor Strong. I'll be back on Friday, April 14th at 11 a.m. right here, live on Fireside, Facebook, and YouTube. Remember, everyone, you got this. We are all in this together. And until next time, everyone.